Before the ancestors and the moon, the Alpha King announced his rejection, his voice echoing through the stunned silence of the ceremonial hall. He did not look at her as he spoke the ancient unforgiving words of severing. He did not look at her as she turned her back on the massive obsidian altar and walked away into the bitter, freezing storm. And he definitely did not know that the child growing beneath her heart carried the forbidden silver fire of his royal ancestors. The grand stone halls of Thornmir Palace had never felt so cavernous, so utterly devoid of warmth. Thousands of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder in the massive amphitheatre, their collective breath rising like pale ghosts in the frigid spring air. The scent of wet fur, polished armor, and burning pine heavily saturated the cavernous space. The spring choosing ceremony was supposed to be a sacred ritual of union. It was supposed to be the dawn of a new era for the pack, a night of celebrated fated bonds and endless devotion. Instead, it became the moment Seren Vantrell's entire world shattered. She stood at the base of the massive stone dais, her rough-spun linen dress offering absolutely no protection against the biting drafts that swept through the high arched windows. Her head remained bowed, her spine perfectly straight. She refused to tremble. She refused to let the elite members of the court see the devastating agony clawing at her throat. High above her, seated on a throne of carved iron and wolf-bone, sat Beatrice Vane. The manipulative dynastic matriarch wore a gown of deep crimson silk, her sharp, calculating eyes tracking every agonizing second of the ceremony with a quiet, highly toxic satisfaction. Beatrice had won. The matriarch had successfully engineered a political nightmare, utilizing a dark, ancient, mind control curse to suppress the true fated bond of the sovereign. Seren did not know the exact mechanics of the dark magic wrapping around her mate's mind. She only knew the catastrophic result. She only saw the terrifying, glacial emptiness in the eyes of the man who had secretly claimed her in the shadowed quiet of the royal gardens just 3 weeks prior. Calin Valerius, Alpha King of Thornmir and commander of 10,000 wolves, stood beside the obsidian altar like a massive statue carved from winter ice. His intimidating physical frame was draped in ceremonial furs and heavy, polished silver armor. The crown of Thornmir rested upon his dark hair, a heavy band of jagged obsidian that seemed to absorb the flickering light of the ceremonial braziers. Those striking, pale irises, usually burning with a fierce, protective molten gold whenever he looked at the quiet outcast, were now completely vacant. They held no recognition. They held no warmth. They were the eyes of a ruthless, unfeeling stranger executing a cold royal duty. Beside the terrifying king stood Maria Sterling. The cruel, status-driven noblewoman wore exquisite silver silk that shimmered like liquid moonlight with every calculated breath she took. Her scent, a heavy, cloying wave of sweet gardenia, wafted down the stone steps, entirely masking the natural scent of crisp snow and pine that rightfully belonged to the palace. Maria wore a practiced, sweet smile that directly contradicted the absolute venom in her triumphant gaze. She was the matriarch's chosen instrument, the purebred replacement meant to secure a flawless, untouchable dynastic alliance. The Alpha King slowly raised his hand, and the low, rumbling murmurs of the immense crowd died instantly. The silence was absolute, heavy and suffocating, pressing against Seren's skin like a physical weight. Her pulse roared in her ears, a frantic, terrified drumbeat that threatened to deafen her. She pressed a trembling, calloused hand to her lower abdomen, carefully hiding the protective gesture within the heavy folds of her fraying cloak. Deep inside the hollow space where her despair threatened to consume her, a tiny, impossible flutter of life pulsed back, a secret heir. A child conceived in absolute love, born of a bond that was supposed to outlast the stars themselves. "I, Calin of the Valerius line," the king began, his voice projecting across the vast granite room with clinical, cold-blooded authority. "Before the goddess and the watching pack, do formally reject the Omega Seren as my true mate." The words struck the young woman like a physical blow from a heavy war hammer. The air in her lungs vanished instantly. On her left wrist, hidden beneath the frayed cuff of her sleeve, the crescent claiming mark suddenly flared with excruciating heat. It was a searing, blistering agony, as if a branding iron had been pressed directly against her fragile veins. The powerful magic of the fated mate bond was violently fighting the rejection, actively resisting the unnatural, forced severing of their intertwined souls. Seren bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted the sharp, metallic tang of blood pooling on her tongue. She did not cry out, she did not beg. She closed her eyes, focusing entirely on the rhythmic, frantic beating of her own heart. Deep within her veins, a dormant celestial magic began to surge in violent rebellion. The ancient cosmic power wanted to burst forth, eager to incinerate the heavy stone room and everyone in it to protect her from this unbearable humiliation. But Seren possessed a terrifying quiet resilience. Through sheer, agonizing mental discipline, she built a cage of iron willpower around her soul. She forced the rising silver fire down, suppressing the dangerous warmth with her own desperate restraint. She could not reveal her son's born lineage here. She could not allow herself to lose control and make herself a target for Beatrice's creeping paranoia. At the altar, the sovereign did not flinch. Guided by the unseen, suffocating chains of the matriarch's curse, he turned away from his true mate. He extended his large, calloused hand toward the noblewoman, draped in silver silk. Resting in the center of his palm was the lunar moon ring. It was an ancient, highly sacred artifact carved from a single piece of falling star, meant only for Thornmir's true Luna. In her place, the Alpha King continued, his tone completely flat and hollow. I claim Maria of the Sterling line as my Luna and Queen. He slid the ring onto Maria's slender finger. The moment the cold metal cleared her knuckle, an elder priest stepped forward from the shadows, holding out a ceremonial parchment and a long black quill. The rejection decree, the final legal severing of the soul tie that bound them. Callan took the quill without a single second of hesitation. He dragged the inked tip across the heavy parchment, signing away his destiny in bold, jagged strokes. The exact second the ink dried on the page, the searing heat on Seren's wrist vanished. It did not simply fade. It was violently snuffed out, exactly like a fragile candle submerged in a frozen lake. A horrific, breathless cold slammed into her chest. The glowing golden thread of magic that had tied her spirit to the massive Alpha snapped with a violent psychic crack that reverberated through her bones. The physical sensation of the broken fated mate bond was a paralyzing, icy numbness. Her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. The world abruptly tilted, the sharp edges of her vision blurring into a dizzying tunnel of dark, rushing shadows. The bond was dead. He had severed it completely. Maria turned her head slightly, locking her sharp eyes with the broken girl standing at the bottom of the long stone steps. The new queen's painted lips curled into a silent, deeply mocking sneer. The message was perfectly clear to everyone in the room. The outcast had been discarded, swept away like useless dust from the royal boots. There was no place for a voiceless, low-status servant in the high and mighty court of Thornmir. Seren did not wait for the armed guards to officially dismiss her. She did not wait for the massive crowd to erupt into thunderous cheers for their new monarch. Moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a ghost, she turned on her heel. The cold stone floor offered no comfort as she walked back down the long central aisle. Thousands of eyes watched her slow retreat, tracking the silent, pathetic tragedy of a rejected Omega. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her expression a mask of hardened, unreadable porcelain. She survived the longest walk of her entire life entirely on the fierce, quiet instinct to protect the tiny life safely hidden inside her. Hours later, the suffocating darkness of the servants' quarters provided the only sanctuary the young woman had left in this brutal kingdom. The small, damp room in the lowest levels of the massive palace smelled strongly of wet stone, old straw, and lingering loneliness. Seren moved through the creeping shadows with mechanical, numb precision. She possessed very little in this world, and she required even less to survive. She opened a battered wooden chest resting at the foot of her narrow, uncomfortable cot. From it she pulled a heavy woolen cloak, a spare pair of sturdy leather boots, and a single well-oiled hunting knife. Her hands hesitated for a fraction of a second as her fingers brushed against a small pile of hidden treasures. She stared down at the beautiful, delicate silk ribbons of midnight blue and the small, exquisitely carved wooden toys the king had brought to her in secret during the deep winter months. Those deeply sentimental items belonged to a man who simply no longer existed. They were the fragile artifacts of a beautiful dream that had violently turned into a suffocating nightmare. She left them resting in the dust at the bottom of the chest, packing a modest satchel with dried venison, hardtack, and a few medicinal herbs she had carefully gathered from the courtyard gardens. She secured the thick leather strap across her chest. Her hands were completely steady now. The agonizing, breathless heartbreak had been replaced by a dense, fiercely protective wall of frost. The empty space behind her ribs, the cavernous void where her mate's dominant presence used to throb with comforting warmth, was now a permanent, aching hollow. She slipped out of the palace through the heavy iron doors of the outer scullery. The violent night air hit her like a physical strike. The weather had turned completely feral, perfectly matching the destruction of the royal bond. A torrential spring storm raged across the jagged mountains. Freezing rain lashed mercilessly against the towering granite walls of the keep, slicing through the heavy wool of her cloak within a matter of minutes. The relentless wind howled through the narrow stone corridors of the outer courtyard, easily masking the quiet sound of her rapid, desperate footsteps. Seren navigated the treacherous, slick cobblestones without a single moment of hesitation. The freezing mud of the outer bailey pulled aggressively at her heavy boots, trying to drag her down into the dirt, but she kept moving forward. She walked past the sleeping guards at the western gate, a girl so entirely unseen and chronically underestimated by the elite that she barely registered as a passing shadow in the raging storm. The bitter wind whipped her wet silver-blonde hair across her face, stinging her flushed cheeks, but the intense physical discomfort was absolutely nothing compared to the deathly silence echoing in her soul. She walked for miles, relentlessly pushing her exhausted, freezing body up the steep, winding cliff paths that led far away from the sprawling capital. The deep, ancient pine forests of the Northern Territory quickly swallowed her whole. The oppressive darkness beneath the heavy canopy was absolute, broken only by the occasional, violent flash of lightning that briefly illuminated the jagged, hostile terrain. By the time the first pale, bruised light of dawn threatened the eastern horizon, she had finally reached the edge of the ancestral wards. The northern border of Thornmir was marked by a long, imposing line of ancient, rune-carved monoliths. Beyond those towering stones lay the lawless wilds, the undisputed coastal territories where the Alpha King's absolute influence could not reach her. Seren stopped at the threshold. She leaned her exhausted frame against the rough, freezing bark of a massive pine tree, her breath coming in ragged, painful white gasps. Her legs burned with deep physical exhaustion. Her hands were entirely numb, her slender fingers stiff and blue from the biting, relentless rain. Slowly, with violently trembling hands, she pulled back the soaked woolen sleeve of her left arm to look at her wrist. The crescent-claiming mark was completely dead. The once vibrant, raised mark that used to pulse with the golden light of the sovereign's fierce love had flattened completely into her pale skin. It was now an ugly, ash-grey scar. The hollow mark did not just contain her pain. It created a terrible void, a freezing absence where the brilliant magic of her soulmate should have been. It was the physical, undeniable proof that she was entirely alone in this brutal world. She lifted her trembling fingers from her wrist and rested them gently against the damp wool covering her stomach. A fierce, sudden rush of golden warmth radiated outward from her core, instantly fighting back the creeping winter chill. It was the ancestral fire, the quiet, undeniable heartbeat of the secret heir growing safely within her. The child was safe, the child was hers. The elite, manipulative matriarchs and the cruel noble women of the high court could keep the king, the stone throne, and the heavy obsidian crown. They would never, ever touch her bloodline. Turning her face directly into the freezing wind, Seren Vantrell stepped past the heavy rune-carved stones. She crossed the border, leaving the corrupted territory of Thornmir behind forever. The howling storm swallowed her small, fragile silhouette instantly, wrapping her safely in a dense shroud of blinding white snow and grey rain. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced, because she was never there to begin with. She vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, and she took the child with her. She walked bravely into the unknown wilderness, fully embracing the harsh, unforgiving exile. The healing process would be incredibly long, and the severe somatic toll of the severed bond would test absolutely every ounce of her physical endurance. But she would not break. She would journey to the farthest coastal edges of the earth to build a new life. She would forge a quiet, untouchable sanctuary where the ancient fire in her blood could safely burn, far away from the monsters that ruled the palace. The journey north took 40 grueling, agonizing days of relentless forward momentum. The exiled Omega walked until the soles of her heavy leather boots wore dangerously thin, and then she walked further still. She navigated through the ancient towering pine forests of the borderlands, crossing frozen streams and scaling jagged, treacherous mountain passes that would have easily killed a weaker wolf. The physical toll was absolute, stripping away her former softness and leaving behind a hardened shell of sheer desperate survival. The bitter, biting cold of the late spring snows numbed her face and cracked her lips, turning her breath into plumes of freezing white mist. But the external physical suffering was an absolute blessing, compared to the frozen wasteland spreading relentlessly through her chest. Every single mile she put between herself and the obsidian altar of Thornmir was another mile of necessary suffocating silence. She did not complain. She did not beg the moon goddess for mercy, nor did she shed a single tear for the life she was leaving behind. She simply kept placing one freezing foot in front of the other, heavily relying on the rhythmic crunch of snow to drown out the memory of his booming voice rejecting her before the entire pack. She eventually crossed the final, sweeping ridgeline, leaving the oppressive canopy of the forest behind to face the vast, churning expanse of the Western Ocean. The air here tasted violently of crushed sea salt, decaying kelp, and biting, unyielding freedom. Clinging desperately to the sheer, fog-shrouded cliffs was the remote coastal village of Brindle Hollow. It was a forgotten, melancholic smear of humanity, entirely ignored by the high lords and elite matriarchs of the capital. It was isolated, poor, and perfectly invisible, which made it the absolute ideal sanctuary for a broken woman who desperately needed to disappear from the face of the earth. The crashing waves below sounded like a perpetual, roaring storm, perfectly matching the chaotic whirlwind of betrayal and heartbreak entirely consuming her mind. The sheer isolation of Brindle Hollow was a physical shock to her system. There were no grand stone walls, no patrolling royal guards, and no sweeping courtyards filled with whispering courtiers. Instead, there was only the relentless, rhythmic crashing of the dark ocean against the jagged cliffs, a sound that completely drowned out her racing thoughts. The villagers moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, their faces permanently lined by the harsh coastal winds, their eyes focused entirely on surviving the bitter seasons rather than engaging in petty political games. For the first time in her entire life, Seren felt completely untethered from the oppressive hierarchy of the wolf packs. The freedom was both exhilarating and deeply terrifying, leaving her utterly alone with the devastating reality of her broken bond. She found an abandoned stone cottage resting on a high, wind-battered promontory overlooking the grey, crashing waves. The slate roof sagged precariously under the weight of creeping coastal ivy, and the heavy oak door hung crookedly on rusted iron hinges. The inside smelled strongly of damp earth, stale ash, and decades of quiet neglect. The stone floor was slick with coastal humidity, and the drafty windows rattled fiercely with every gust of ocean wind. But as she stood in the center of the dark freezing room, the young woman closed her eyes and took a deep, trembling breath. It smelled exactly like safety. There were no gilded mirrors here to reflect her low status. There were no judging noble eyes waiting to mock her quiet demeanor. There was only the endless, roaring ocean and the beautiful, uncompromising isolation. She did not rest. She could not afford the dangerous luxury of stillness. Because whenever she stopped moving, the psychological horror of the pack trail threatened to pull her under the dark, crushing waves of despair. She threw herself into the brutal, exhausting physical labor of mending the ruined homestead. Her hands, which had once delicately poured honeyed wine into silver goblets for the royal court, quickly grew heavily corlused, blistered, and split. She stripped the damp ivy from the stone walls until her fingers bled, the stinging pain grounding her wildly spinning thoughts. She repaired the sagging roof with thick bundles of dried coastal reeds, hauling heavy buckets of fresh water from the icy stream at the base of the cliff. The sheer physical exhaustion became a necessary, highly effective numbing agent against the phantom aches of her severed soul. She worked until her muscles burned and her vision blurred, forcefully replacing her emotional devastation with the undeniable, somatic reality of calloused skin and aching bones. The crescent claiming mark on her left wrist remained a flat, ugly ash-grey scar. It was a dead, frozen expanse of skin that completely refused to heal. It did not burn with the passionate, golden heat of the fated bond anymore. Instead, it throbbed with a persistent, dull ache, a deeply terrifying, hollow sensation that constantly reminded her of the massive, unfeeling beast who had effortlessly thrown her away for political convenience. But she refused to look back. She refused to let the ghost of the terrifying sovereign haunt her new walls. Every time the mark ached with the memory of Calin Valerius, she forced herself to chop another log of firewood or grind another mortar of bitter medicinal roots. She integrated into the quiet rhythm of the village with slow, deliberate caution. The locals were a hardened, wary people, heavily weathered by the unforgiving coastal climate, but they inherently respected silence and relentless hard work. She introduced herself simply as Neve, a humble traveler seeking the quiet of the coast, completely dropping any pretense of her former life in the capital. She carefully avoided any mention of wolves, packs, or the sovereign court. Instead, she began offering her extensive, self-taught knowledge of medicinal herbs in exchange for basic staple supplies. She brewed willow bark for the fishermen's aching joints and crafted potent elderberry syrups for the village children, slowly weaving herself into the vital, beating heart of Brindle Hollow. Her closest neighbor was a man named Cormac Thorn, a massive, heavily scarred individual who lived in a small timber cabin further down the winding cliff path. He was a stoic, retired guardian of the Northern Territories, his broad shoulders and missing left eye bearing the brutal, undeniable physical testimony of decades spent fighting feral rogues. Cormac never asked a single question about her past. He never stared at the ugly grey scar on her wrist, or questioned why a beautiful young woman lived entirely alone on a dangerous cliff edge. He simply arrived at her sagging wooden gate one freezing morning with a massive cord of freshly chopped firewood, dumped the heavy logs onto her porch, and offered a curt, silent nod before turning away. His quiet, imposing presence quickly became a foundational pillar of her fragile new reality, a silent promise of absolute neighborhood protection. It was during her 5th month in the coastal sanctuary that the sheer magical demand of the child growing within her finally caught up to her exhausted body. She collapsed in her small herb garden, her vision swimming in a dizzying tunnel of dark spots. The damp coastal soil rose up to meet her cheek, and the world went entirely black. When she woke, she was lying on her narrow, uncomfortable cot inside the cottage, the heavy woolen blanket pulled tightly to her chin. A roaring fire blazed in the hearth, violently driving back the coastal dampness. Sitting beside her was Gwenna Moss, the village midwife. The older woman possessed kind, deeply crinkled eyes and warm, calloused hands that perpetually smelled of dried chamomile, crushed lavender, and warm baked bread. Gwenna had been quietly observing the young, mysterious healer for months, noting the subtle, undeniable changes in her scent, and the careful, protective posture she assumed whenever strangers approached. "Hush now, little bird," the midwife murmured gently, her voice a soothing, rhythmic rumble over the howling wind, rattling the wooden shutters. "You have pushed yourself far past the breaking point. Your body is fighting to feed 2 fires, and you only have enough kindling for 1. You must rest, or the winter will claim you both before the first snow." Gwenna pressed her warm, experienced hands gently against the young woman's slightly swollen abdomen. The silence in the small stone room stretched, becoming incredibly heavy with unspoken tension. Seren held her breath, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs in absolute, helpless terror. She feared the worst. She feared the intense, brutal journey, and the severe malnutrition of her exile had destroyed the fragile life she was desperately trying to save. Then, a profound, beaming smile broke across the older woman's weathered, sun-spotted face. The confirmation was simple, spoken in a soft, reverent whisper. "There," Gwenna breathed, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "A strong, incredibly vital heartbeat. The child is perfectly healthy, but he is drawing a massive amount of energy from your core. You carry a very powerful wolf, my girl, a bloodline that demands the strength of the earth itself." The moment the words left the midwife's lips, a fundamental, earth-shattering shift occurred within the exiled Omega. The lingering, suffocating grief of the public rejection instantly evaporated, completely incinerated by an all-consuming, terrifying wave of maternal protectiveness. Seren placed her own trembling, blistered hand over Gwenna's. Deep beneath her skin, a spark of pure, blinding celestial light pulsed in violent response. The dormant, cosmic silver fire magic, a forbidden ancestral lineage she had ruthlessly suppressed her entire life to survive the oppressive hierarchy of the capital, finally began to blossom. It rose up to wrap securely around the fragile heartbeat inside her, forming an impenetrable, glowing shield of ancestral warmth. Knowing the sheer, apocalyptic danger of this radiant power being detected by the capital, Seren frantically pulled a weathered silver pendant from beneath her heavy woolen tunic. It was the silver fire amulet, an ancient runic artifact passed down through her forgotten bloodline. Her fingers trembled violently as she grasped the cold metal. The heavy silver pendant was intricately carved with ancient celestial runes, specifically forged centuries ago by the original Sunborn kings to dampen raw celestial energy. She desperately needed it now to suppress her blooming magic and completely hide her unborn son's potent royal aura from any dark tracking spells used by the elite matriarchs. She closed her eyes, letting the heavy amulet rest flat against her collarbone, feeling its icy, magical suppression immediately bite into her skin to violently mask their blinding light. The magical void it created was deeply uncomfortable, but it was the only shield she possessed. Gwenna patted her hand, her gaze deeply understanding, completely ignoring the faint, unnatural golden glow that briefly illuminated the young mother's pale skin before the amulet successfully snuffed it out. "We are small things in a world of teeth, my Seren. Smallness is a gift. Use it. Hide in the tall grass, grow your roots deep and protect what is yours. Do not let the big wolves see you shine." "I will," she whispered, her voice completely devoid of tears, replaced by an iron-clad, unbreakable vow. The elite court could keep their cold stone palace and their stolen obsidian crowns. She had the sun growings inside her, and she would burn the world to ash before she let them touch him. 2 years passed in a slow, continuous blur of shifting coastal seasons. The brutal, unforgiving winters froze the ocean's spray into jagged daggers of solid ice along the cliffside, while the humid summers brought thick, rolling banks of dense sea fog that swallowed the small village whole. Through it all, the stone cottage on the promontory remained a beacon of quiet, undeniable warmth and absolute safety. She built a thriving, highly respected apothecary out of the small front room of her cottage. The hardened villagers heavily relied on her carefully brewed salves for their winter frostbite, her bitter root tinctures for their lingering fevers, and her quiet, observant strength during times of hardship. She dried bundles of yarrow and sage from the wooden rafters, filling the damp stone space with a rich, earthy perfume that effectively masked her true scent. She was no longer the fragile, invisible servant who nervously poured wine with her head bowed to avoid the cruel gazes of the nobility. She had completely rebuilt herself in the silence of exile. She was a master healer, a fierce mother, and the undisputed sovereign of her own small, untouchable domain. Aidan Vantrell was the absolute center of her entire universe. Now approaching his 3rd year, he was a strikingly beautiful, quiet child, possessing a watchful, deeply calculating intelligence that far exceeded his young age. His thick hair was a shock of pure, spun silver, effortlessly capturing the pale coastal sunlight and reflecting it back with an unnatural, luminescent glow. But it was his eyes that constantly forced his mother's heart into a terrifying, frantic rhythm. They were a piercing, storm grey that violently shifted into a burning, molten gold whenever his emotions ran high. They were the exact, undeniable eyes of the man who had thrown her away. Raising him was a delicate, constantly terrifying balance. The supreme royal traits of his bloodline were entirely impossible to hide, continuously pushing heavily against the suppressive wards she maintained. The young boy possessed an unnatural, deeply predatory physical strength. By his 2nd summer, he was effortlessly lifting heavy, wooden buckets of well water and moving large granite stones that should have been physically impossible for a toddler. His physical movements were too fluid, too dangerously graceful for a normal child. Cormac noticed the anomaly immediately. The scarred, one-eyed guardian would often sit quietly on their weathered wooden porch, meticulous whittling small wooden animal figures with his sharp hunting knife, his single eye tracking the boy's fluid, impossibly graceful movements. But the old warrior remained absolutely silent. He never demanded an explanation for the boy's terrifying strength or the glowing metallic sheen of his silver hair. He fiercely guarded their secret with the exact same stoic, uncompromising loyalty he gave to his own breath, standing as a silent sentinel between their fragile sanctuary and the harsh outside world. The somatic connection of a fated mate bond was an ancient, unbreakable law of the moon goddess. When it was healthy, it felt like a warm, golden sun radiating from the center of the chest. When it was severed, it left behind a rotting, gangrenous magical wound that slowly consumed the host. Seren had survived the initial, violent tearing of the bond through sheer willpower and the sudden, overwhelming priority of her pregnancy. But Calin Valerius did not have a child to anchor his soul. He only had the cold, heavy obsidian crown of Thornmir and the toxic, manipulative lies of his royal court. The violent severing of the mate bond had left a permanent, highly destructive physical toll on the young mother's body. The crescent claiming mark remained a flat, numb, ash-grey scar. For years, it had been nothing but a dead, frozen expanse of ruined skin, but recently a deeply unsettling change had occurred. During the deepest, darkest hours of the freezing winter nights, a strange, Sickening sensation began to echo across the magical void. It was not the burning heat of love, nor the searing agony of rejection. It was a terrifying hollow throb, a ghostly, desperate phantom pulse that spoke of a massive, incredibly powerful beast, slowly, agonizingly starving to death in a distant stone castle. The pulse felt like absolute, unrelenting despair, vibrating through her bones like a cracked bell. It was the somatic echo of a king deteriorating from the inside out, his soul rotting away from the violently severed bond. Deep down, she knew he was dying. A wolf could not survive long without its fated other half, and Kalin was no exception. But Seren aggressively ignored it. She violently pushed the sensation away, burying the phantom pain beneath the immediate, tangible demands of her growing son. He had chosen Maria Sterling, the silver-draped pureblood who looked at Seren like she was nothing more than dirt beneath her boots. He had willingly bowed to Beatrice Vane's toxic dynastic alliance, allowing the cruel matriarch to dictate the future of his throne. Let him slowly rot in the freezing bed he had made for himself. He had discarded his true mate for a political lie, and she owed him absolutely nothing. The fragile, perfect illusion of their domestic sanctuary demanded constant vigilance. The coastal wind howled ferociously off the churning ocean on a brutally cold evening in late autumn, violently rattling the heavy wooden shutters of the cottage. Inside, the massive stone hearth fire crackled cheerfully, throwing warm, dancing golden shadows across the thick woven rugs. Cormac had delivered a fresh, massive bundle of dried pine that afternoon, and the rich, sappy scent heavily saturated the small room, providing a thick blanket of sensory comfort. Aidan was sitting quietly on the rug near the roaring fire, meticulously stacking a set of hand-carved wooden blocks the old guardian had gifted him. His mother stood at the heavy oak table, her calloused hands methodically grinding dried willow bark with a heavy stone mortar and pestle. The domestic peace was profound, a deeply earned, flawless bubble of sanctuary. Yet beneath the surface, an undeniable tension hummed. The silver fire amulet rested heavy against her collarbone, vibrating faintly as it worked overtime to suppress the raw, wild celestial energy radiating from her son. Every day, Aidan grew stronger, and the ancient royal magic in his blood pushed violently against the artifact's invisible boundaries. Seren watched his small, silver-haired head tilt as he played, her heart clenching with fierce, terrified devotion. The amulet was the only thing standing between their quiet sanctuary and the ruthless trackers of Thornmir. If the magical suppression failed for even a second, the elite matriarchs would sense the birth of a living god and send an entire army to drag him back to their obsidian throne. Suddenly, another sickening, hollow throb pulsed through the dead claiming mark on her wrist, sharper and more desperate than ever before. It was a visceral, agonizing spike of pure devastation from the severed bond, indicating that the cursed king across the mountains was reaching his absolute breaking point. Seren gritted her teeth, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the heavy stone pestle. She would not let the failing pulse of the past breach her sanctuary. She had the sun growing right here in her kitchen, and she would rely on the cold silver of her amulet to keep the monsters completely in the dark. But the magic of a severed mate bond was a two-way mirror of suffering. That agonizing, hollow pulse traveled backward along the frayed edges of their severed connection, echoing across the bitter mountains and frozen forests. Hundreds of miles away, completely isolated within the towering, oppressive granite walls of Thornmir Palace, the source of that devastating phantom pulse was violently tearing himself apart. The once glorious royal bedchamber, traditionally a sanctuary of warmth and luxurious furs, had been transformed into a freezing, clinical prison. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the biting winter winds, plunging the massive stone room into suffocating darkness. The air was thick with the sickening metallic scent of rotting magic and stale blood. Kaelin Valerius, the fearsome Alpha King who commanded 10,000 wolves, was reduced to a trembling, emaciated shadow of his former dominance. His intimidating physical frame, once built of solid muscle and ruthless authority, was now rapidly deteriorating. His skin was pale, stretched far too tight over his sharp cheekbones, and his once vivid irises were clouded with a deeply unnatural, toxic black mist. He was thrashing violently against the heavy iron chains that bound him to the massive oak bedframe. The restraints were not for his protection. They were absolutely necessary to keep his maddened, feral wolf from completely slaughtering the elite royal guards stationed outside the heavy oak doors. Standing beside the ruined sovereign was Eldrin Vance. The elderly pack physician and high priest of the capital looked entirely exhausted, his ancient, weathered face lined with deep exhaustion and chronic worry. For 2 agonizing years, Eldrin had desperately searched for the root cause of the king's sudden, catastrophic decline. Everyone in the treacherous court believed the Alpha was simply dying of a rare blood disease, a tragic flaw in the royal lineage. But the old doctor knew the terrifying truth. He had spent months secretly translating forbidden, ancient runic texts hidden deep within the palace archives, slowly unraveling the dark, suffocating threads of a highly illegal manipulation spell. Eldrin meticulously crushed a handful of glowing, heavily aromatic sunfire roots in a heavy iron mortar. The roots were incredibly rare, harvested from the lethal southern volcanic slopes, possessing the unique, aggressive magical properties required to burn away deep psychological rot. The priest had sacrificed his own health, spending countless sleepless nights in the dust-choked archives to perfectly synthesize this cure. He knew the matriarch, Beatrice Vane, would have him executed if she discovered his treasonous research. But his loyalty remained fiercely tied to the true king, not the manipulative spider spinning webs on the obsidian throne. The sharp, spicy scent of the burning herbs temporarily masked the stench of decay filling the freezing room. "Hold him down," the doctor commanded, his voice a sharp, uncompromising crack of authority that cut through the king's feral growls. 4 massive, heavily armored elite guards immediately stepped forward, pressing their combined weight against the thrashing monarch. The men grunted in extreme physical exertion, struggling desperately to contain the chaotic, surging strength of the dying beast. The elderly priest approached the bed, holding a small, silver chalice filled with the boiling golden liquid. He did not hesitate. He ruthlessly forced the burning elixir past the sovereign's cracked, bleeding lips. "The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be," Eldrin murmured, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic chant as he pressed his glowing magic-saturated palm directly against the Alpha's chest. "It is a parasite, my king, a poison placed there by your own blood now. Let it burn." The reaction was instantaneous and violently explosive. The moment the golden liquid met the dark, toxic magic anchoring the curse, Kaelin arched off the mattress with a bone-shattering, blood-curdling scream. The black mist in his eyes instantly boiled away, replaced by a searing, blinding flash of pure, molten gold. The heavy iron chains holding him down groaned and snapped under a sudden, impossible surge of physical power. The 4 elite guards were violently thrown backward, crashing heavily against the stone walls like discarded rag dolls. The oppressive, suffocating glass jar that had encased Kaelin's mind for over 2 years shattered into a million jagged, psychic pieces. The psychological manipulation, meticulously woven by Beatrice to secure a purebred alliance, completely disintegrated as the toxic fog lifted. Absolute, pristine clarity slammed into the Alpha's brain with the devastating force of a falling mountain. He sucked in a massive, agonizing breath, his lungs expanding as if he were breathing real air for the very first time in years. Memories flooded his consciousness. They were not the manufactured, false memories of loving Maria Sterling. They were the raw, agonizing, blinding truths of what he had actually done. He saw the spring choosing ceremony. He felt the phantom weight of the lunar moon ring in his palm, the sacred, heavy silver band he had callously slipped onto the wrong woman's finger. He remembered the exact, sickening moment the golden thread connecting his soul to his true mate had snapped, echoing with a psychic crack that he had blindly ignored under the suffocating influence of the dark spell. He saw Seren. He saw her beautiful, quiet face, perfectly composed as she accepted the ultimate humiliation without shedding a single tear. Her absolute, dignified silence in the face of his brutal cruelty now felt like 1,000 rusted blades twisting directly into his gut. He watched her turn her back on him and walk out into the freezing storm, carrying his heart, his soul, and his entire world with her. "No," Kaelin gasped, his voice tearing violently from his throat. "No, no, no." The physical realization of the severed bond hit him with a paralyzing, icy shockwave. He scrambled to his knees on the ruined bed, frantically tearing away the heavy linen bandages wrapped around his left wrist. The crescent-claiming mark, which should have been pulsing with a warm, golden, protective light, was nothing but a dead, flat, ash-grey scar. He stared at it, his broad shoulders trembling violently as the full, suffocating weight of his horrific actions crushed the breath from his lungs. His wolf, fully awakened from the dark magical slumber, let out a sound that would haunt the stone halls of Thornmir for generations. It was not a roar of dominance. It was an agonizing, feral howl of pure, unadulterated devastation. The beast was weeping. The terrifying, ruthless sovereign dropped his head into his trembling hands, his large frame shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. He had thrown her away. He had publicly discarded the only woman who had ever looked at him with genuine, quiet warmth. He had replaced his beautiful mate with a toxic, manipulative stranger because his own mother had poisoned his mind. Eldrin stood quietly in the corner, his head bowed in deep, respectful silence, allowing the broken king to fully experience the agonizing rebirth. The old doctor knew that healing could only begin after the rotting infection had been completely burned away. He watched the massive predator break down, offering absolutely no words of hollow comfort, simply bearing witness to the sovereign's profound, shattering grief. Deep within his hollowed chest, the phantom pulse of the severed mate bond gave a sickening, dying throb, a somatic echo reaching across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness to find him. As that final, agonizing resonance faded into the stone walls, the weeping slowly stopped. The devastating sorrow radiating from the Alpha crystallized into something else. It turned into a terrifying glacial rage. The air in the room plummeted in temperature, frost rapidly forming on the edges of the stone hearth. Kalin Valerius raised his head. His piercing gaze burned with a lethal, molten gold intensity that promised uncompromising slaughter. He stood from the ruined bed, ignoring the screaming agony of his atrophied muscles. He was no longer a dying, cursed shadow. He was the Alpha King of Thornmir, and his mind was razor-sharp, cutting through the lingering exhaustion with brutal efficiency. "Eldrin," the king whispered. His voice was dangerously soft, carrying a lethal edge that made the remaining guards tremble. "Tell the commander of the elite guard to seal the palace gates. No one leaves. No one enters." "It is already done, my king," the old doctor replied, a dark, satisfied glint in his ancient eyes. Caitlin stepped over the shattered iron chains, his bare feet immune to the freezing stone floor. "Arrest Maria, arrest Beatrice. Throw them both into the lowest, darkest cells beneath the obsidian keep. If they resist, break their legs. They will face a public trial the moment I return." He did not wait for the priest to acknowledge the command. The king turned his back on the corrupted chamber and strode into the freezing stone corridor, his mind locked onto a single impossible task. He had to find her. He had to cross the ends of the earth, track her through the most hostile environments, and drop to his knees in the dirt to beg for a mercy he did not deserve. He would tear the world apart, stone by stone, until he found the quiet, resilient woman he had broken. The physical decay caused by the severed, fated bond did not magically disappear with the breaking of the mind control curse. If anything, the stark awareness of the missing connection only intensified his somatic suffering. Every breath Kaelin took felt like inhaling crushed glass. The hollow void in his chest throbbed with a persistent, sickening rhythm, a constant, punishing reminder of the crime he had committed against his own soul. But he did not allow the agony to slow his relentless momentum. He weaponized the pain. He used the burning, freezing ache of his dead-claiming mark as a desperate, internal compass to guide his frantic search. For weeks, the massive Alpha scoured the sprawling territories of Thornmir and beyond. Leaving the political cleanup of the capital in Eldrin's hands, he transformed into his colossal black wolf form, pushing his starving, deteriorating body far past the limits of normal lichen endurance. He ran until his massive paws bled against jagged granite rocks. He ran until his lungs burned and his muscles screamed in protest. He refused to rest. He refused to eat. He refused to acknowledge the bitter, freezing winter storms that constantly lashed his dark fur. He tracked her across 3 different kingdoms, following the ghostly echoes of a scent almost entirely erased by time and harsh weather. He navigated through the bustling trading outposts of the eastern valleys in human form, ignoring the terrified gasps of local merchants who recognized his royal crest. He scoured the desolate, wind-swept plains of the southern borders, searching every abandoned barn and ruined homestead for a single, lingering trace of her unique warmth. She vanished like smoke through a crack in the world, and she took to the child with her. She left behind nothing but the crushing reality of his failure. The elite trackers of the Royal Guard struggled desperately to keep pace with their maddened sovereign. They watched in quiet, terrified awe as the most powerful male in the known realms abandoned his legendary stoicism, frantically tearing through frozen earth and deep snowbanks like a starving beast searching for water. No woman lasted a night with him, they had whispered, but one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime, and he had blindly cast her out into the unforgiving cold. The torturous journey eventually led the desperate monarch to the extreme northern edge of the known territories. The towering pine forests here were ancient, oppressive, and heavily saturated with the biting scent of impending blizzards. The heavy canopy blocked out the pale winter sun, plunging the jagged landscape into a perpetual, freezing twilight. It was a hostile wilderness where even the most hardened rogue wolves hesitated to tread, a place designed to swallow weak creatures whole. Kaelin shifted back into his human form, his breathing ragged and uneven. He stood at the edge of a frozen, winding stream, his broad chest heaving against the freezing wind. Dressed only in a simple woolen tunic and dark leather trousers, he ignored the biting frost rapidly coating his dark hair and eyelashes. He scanned the desolate, snow-covered banks, desperate for any physical sign that the exiled Omega had passed this way. The hollow mark on his left wrist suddenly gave a weak, pathetic throb. It was not a pulse of connection, but rather a ghostly resonance, a localized reaction to something deeply familiar in the immediate environment. The king froze, his entire body going rigid. He dropped to his knees in the deep snow, his corloosed hands frantically brushing away the thick layers of white powder near the base of an ancient pine tree. His fingers brushed against something unnatural in the wild landscape. It was small, partially buried in the frozen mud, and incredibly fragile. Kaelin's breath hitched in his throat. He carefully, reverently pulled the object from the ice, his hands trembling with fierce magnitude. It was a faded, midnight blue silk ribbon. The delicate material was heavily weathered, stiff with frost, and slightly frayed at the edges, but it was undeniably hers. It was one of the secret, intimate gifts he had brought to the quiet servant girl during the deep-hidden winter months, before the toxic magic had stolen his mind. She must have dropped it during her desperate flight into the wilderness. The ribbon carried the faintest trace of her unique scent, a calming blend of crushed wild mint, ancient pine, and the soft warmth of sunlight on fresh snow. He remembered the exact night he had given it to her. The palace had been quiet, blanketed in a soft snowfall. She had been sitting near the kitchen hearth, her calloused hands resting in her lap, exhausted from a long day of serving the cruel nobility. He had secretly slipped the delicate silk into her palm, watching with adoration as a rare, beautiful smile illuminated her tired features. That memory now felt like a physical weapon, bludgeoning his sanity into jagged pieces. Kalin pressed the freezing, dirty fabric against his lips. He closed his eyes as a shuddering sob racked his massive frame. The scent was a devastating blow to his rotting soul. It was absolute, undeniable proof that she had survived the initial journey. She had walked through this freezing hell entirely alone, carrying the unbearable weight of his cruel rejection, without anyone to protect her. He knelt in the snow for a long time. The ruthless sovereign of Thornmir was reduced to a broken, weeping man clutching a tiny scrap of blue silk. The silence of the ancient forest pressed heavily against him, offering no comfort, only the cold reality of his failure. The towering trees stood like silent sentinels, witnessing the destruction of a king who had thrown away his only salvation. But amidst the crushing despair, a tiny spark of desperate hope finally ignited in the darkness of his mind. The somatic pull of the severed bond had been incredibly weak, almost non-existent for years. But here, holding the physical token his true mate had touched, the phantom compass in his chest shifted. It did not point south toward the wealthy cities of the Packlands. It pointed directly west, toward the jagged coastal cliffs and the roaring expanse of the Western Ocean. The faint tug resonated deep within his marrow, locking onto a distant, hidden warmth that refused to die. She had built a sanctuary far away from his corrupted throne, believing she was safe from the monsters of her past. She had carefully hidden herself in the tall grass, suppressing her beautiful cosmic light to protect herself from the man who had broken her heart. She was wrong, because the Alpha King had finally discovered the truth, and he was coming for what was his. He carefully folded the fragile blue ribbon, tucking it securely into the pocket of his tunic to rest directly over his racing heart. The physical decay ravaging his body no longer mattered. The freezing winter storms howling through the ancient pines no longer mattered. Kalin Valerius stood up, his massive frame radiating a terrifying determination that physically melted the snow immediately surrounding his boots. The hollow ache in his wrist was now a burning, relentless brand driving him forward. He shifted back into his colossal black wolf form, his bones cracking and snapping in the freezing air. The beast threw its massive head back and released a deafening roar that shook the heavy snow from the branches above. It was a promise. It was a vow of uncompromising devotion and impending submission that echoed for miles across the desolate landscape. He launched himself into the dense, frozen underbrush, his massive paws tearing through the deep snow with explosive speed. The elite royal trackers abandoned their camp, scrambling to follow the chaotic path of their sovereign. The king was no longer searching blindly in the dark. He had a direction. He had a destination. He would not stop running until he found the coastal edge of the world, until he found the quiet woman who held his severed soul, and until he finally fell to his knees in the dirt to beg for her mercy. The dense, fog-choked woods bordering the jagged coastal cliffs of Brindle Hollow were steeped in an oppressive silence. Late autumn was rapidly bleeding into a bitter winter, stripping the ancient pine trees of their remaining warmth and leaving behind a skeletal landscape. The relentless ocean wind usually roared through the thick canopy, but this afternoon the air was terrifyingly still. The suffocating quiet felt unnatural, like a massive predator holding its breath just before a lethal strike. Aidan Vantrell was playing near the rugged tree line, entirely oblivious to the creeping shadows. The 3-year-old child was a striking anomaly against the dreary grey backdrop of the coastal wilderness. His thick hair was a luminescent shock of pure silver, effortlessly catching the meager ambient light and reflecting a soft, celestial glow. He was currently attempting to lift a heavily waterlogged piece of driftwood easily twice his own body weight. The young boy grunted, his tiny muscles flexing with an impossible physical density that rightfully belonged only to the supreme royal bloodline of the capital. Sitting on a weathered cedar stump a few yards away, Cormac Thorne maintained a silent, unblinking vigil. The scarred, one-eyed neighbor held a sharp hunting knife in his corlused right hand, methodically carving a block of soft pine, but his attention was entirely focused on the child. The retired guardian had spent decades surviving the lawless borders of the Packlands, and his finely tuned survival instincts were currently screaming in protest. The hairs on the back of his thick neck stood rigid. The atmospheric pressure in the clearing was dropping rapidly, creating a sickening vacuum that made his pulse race. The wind suddenly shifted, rolling off the dark mountains instead of the ocean. It carried a horrific metallic stench that coated the back of Cormac's throat. It was the undeniable smell of rotting blood, wet feral fur, and toxic, corrupted magic. Aidan, the old warrior, commanded, his voice a low, sharp gravel that demanded absolute obedience. "Come here, right now." The silver-haired child dropped the heavy driftwood, his perceptive gaze snapping toward the dense underbrush. He did not run to his protector. Instead, the boy's spine stiffened, his small frame radiating a shocking, predatory stillness. Deep within his irises, a terrifying flash of burning, molten gold flared brilliantly. Even at 3 years old, the royal heir possessed the deeply ingrained, instinctual awareness of a sovereign facing a direct threat. From the darkness of the ancient pines, 5 massive, feral wolves silently materialized. They were grotesque monstrosities, their emaciated bodies covered in jagged, infected scars and matted, filth-encrusted fur. These were not ordinary border rogues. Their eyes burned with an unnatural crimson light, indicating they were heavily corrupt mercenaries. Remnants of the manipulative factions loyal to Beatrice Vane, sent into the wilderness months ago to hunt down any leaking traces of supreme royal magic. They had finally found the source of the anomaly. The largest of the feral beasts, a towering monstrosity with half of its face torn away, locked its crimson gaze entirely on the silver-haired child. A low, wet, rattling growl vibrated through the freezing clearing. The creature recognized the impossible strength radiating from the boy. It recognized the molten gold defiance in his eyes. This was the hidden heir of Thornmir, an unprotected, valuable target just waiting to be slaughtered in the dirt. Cormac did not hesitate. He kicked away the wooden stump, his massive frame expanding as he drew 2 long, serrated hunting blades from the leather sheaths strapped to his thighs. He stepped directly into the lethal path between the monstrous rogues and the young child, his broad shoulders forming an impenetrable wall of defense. The stoic guardian knew he was severely outnumbered and vastly overpowered, entirely likely to die in this frozen clearing, but he possessed an unbreakable loyalty to the quiet sanctuary they had built. The feral pack lunged simultaneously, attacking with chaotic, blinding speed. The clearing erupted into a deafening chaos of vicious snarls, the crash of bodies against frozen earth, and the wet, sickening sound of sharp steel biting into corrupted flesh. Cormac fought with brutal, calculated efficiency. He sidestepped a snapping jaw, driving his left blade upward through the ribcage of a black rogue, instantly collapsing the beast's lung. He spun on his heel, using his heavy boots to shatter the knee joint of a second attacker, before burying his right knife deep into its thick neck. But the sheer, overwhelming physical mass of the remaining assassins was too much for a single aging warrior. The massive, half-faced leader flanked him from his blind side, launching its colossal weight directly against Cormac's chest. The impact was exactly like being struck by a falling boulder. The retired guardian was violently thrown backward, his heavy body crashing brutally against a jagged granite outcropping. The sickening crack of fracturing ribs echoed loudly over the roaring ocean waves below. Before Cormac could recover his footing, a fourth rogue clamped its massive, rotting jaws tightly around his left thigh, violently dragging him away from the boulder and thrashing its head to shred the muscle. The old warrior roared in agonizing pain, desperately stabbing his remaining blade into the creature's skull, but the damage was already catastrophic. His vision blurred, his blood rapidly pooling on the frost-covered soil. He could not rise. He was physically pinned to the earth, desperately gasping for air as the dark shadows closed in around him. The towering leader of the assassins ignored the bleeding guardian. The monstrous wolf turned its attention back to the child, slowly stalking forward with predatory anticipation. Thick, dark saliva dripped from its exposed fangs, hissing and smoking as it hit the frozen ground. Aidan was cornered against the cold granite stone. The 3-year-old heir did not cower. He did not cry out for mercy or attempt to flee into the treacherous cliffs. The tiny boy simply balled his small hands into tight fists, his chin raised in uncompromising defiance. The molten gold in his eyes blazed with the fierce pride of the Alpha King's lineage, rejecting the impending slaughter. He was a small thing in a world of teeth, but he possessed the spirit of a reigning monarch. The massive rogue lunged forward, its jaws opening wide to crush the fragile life. The freezing air in the clearing seemed to shatter into a million jagged pieces, holding perfectly still in a terrifying, suspended microsecond of impending doom. Less than a mile away, deep within the warm safety of the apothecary cottage, Seren Vantrell was meticulously pouring boiling water over dried chamomile leaves. The quiet domestic peace was absolute, a deeply earned sanctuary she had bled for every single day of her exile. Suddenly, the heavy silver fire amulet resting against her chest grew violently, searingly hot. It did not just warm her skin, it burned with the intensity of a blacksmith's forge, branding a blistering red crescent into her delicate collarbone. A horrific, deafening psychic scream ripped through her mind, completely bypassing her physical ears. It was the raw, primal terror of her child, a desperate, somatic flare of danger that violently tore down every emotional wall she had constructed. Seren dropped the heavy iron kettle. The boiling water shattered the fragile ceramic cups and hissed against the stone floor, but she did not even register the chaos. The physical toll of the suppression artifact was no longer acceptable. The amulet, designed to contain the terrifying power of a celestial bloodline, began to violently crack under the sudden surge of her maternal desperation. She grabbed the heavy silver pendant with both hands and ruthlessly ripped it from her neck, shattering the ancient runes and breaking the chain. The exact second the magical suppression was removed, a blinding wave of pure cosmic energy exploded from her core. The ancient, forbidden silver fire she had hidden her entire life surged through her veins like a localized hurricane. It was beautiful in the way a freshly forged, lethal blade was beautiful. She did not grab a cloak. She did not grab a weapon. She exploded through the heavy oak door of the cottage, her boots tearing the wooden hinges completely out of the stone frame. She ran toward the tree line with blinding, terrifying speed, her feet barely touching the frozen earth. The atmospheric pressure in the woods warped and twisted around her, the freezing fog instantly vaporizing as she passed. The agonizing, hollow ache of her dead claiming mark was completely overridden by the roaring inferno of her celestial magic. She was a mother rushing to save her universe, and nothing in the mortal realm could stand in her way. The young mother breached the edge of the clearing at the exact microsecond the massive rogue assassin launched itself toward her son. "No!" Seren screamed, a sound that did not belong to a quiet, invisible servant. It was the earth-shattering, sovereign command of a sun-born queen. Without a single second of hesitation, she thrust both of her collused hands forward. A blinding solid wall of pure, liquid silver fire erupted from her palms, striking the lunging monstrosity with the catastrophic force of a falling star. The massive, corrupted wolf did not even have time to register the impact. The intense, celestial heat hit the beast mid-air, instantly incinerating its rotting flesh and heavy bones. The rogue was completely reduced to a cloud of fine grey ash before it ever touched the frozen ground. The remaining assassins froze in paralyzing terror, their sick crimson eyes widening as they stared at the beautiful, terrifying woman stepping fully into the clearing. Seren was practically floating, her physical body radiating a blinding, ethereal light that violently illuminated the darkest corners of the ancient forest. Her silver-blonde hair whipped wildly around her face in an unseen tempest of magical pressure. The bitter, freezing winter frost was instantly banished, replaced by a searing wave of intense, golden-silver heat that physically cracked the granite boulders. The rogue assassins didn't know that the woman standing in the clearing possessed a dormant cosmic magic, capable of burning entire armies to the ground. They had hunted a fragile, outcast Omega, completely unaware they had just cornered a living deity. The 3 remaining wolves scrambled frantically backward, whining in high-pitched, desperate terror as their corrupted instincts finally registered the apocalyptic threat. But the newly awakened sovereign offered no mercy. The time for hiding in the tall grass was permanently over. She swept her right arm in a wide, vicious arc. A wave of liquid silver fire rolled across the frozen earth, pursuing the fleeing beasts with intelligent, lethal precision. The cosmic flames consumed the corrupted mercenaries in a matter of seconds, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth and the sharp, metallic scent of ozone. The sudden, devastating violence ended as quickly as it had begun. The forest fell into a breathless, echoing silence, the dense canopy glowing softly with the fading remnants of her celestial light. Seren immediately dropped to her knees in the smouldering dirt, her blinding magical aura rapidly contracting and sinking back beneath her skin. The physical exhaustion of channeling the supreme power hit her violently, but she ignored the crushing weight in her bones. Scrambling forward, she wrapped her arms frantically around Aiden's small, trembling body. She pulled him tightly against her chest, burying her face in his bright silver hair, inhaling his sweet, flawless scent to ground her wildly spinning reality. "I have you," she violently sobbed, rocking him back and forth on the scorched earth. "I have you. You are safe. You are safe." Because when she saw him standing there, cornered and completely abandoned by the protective laws of the world, something inside her roared that she had to save him, even if saving him completely destroyed the quiet sanctuary she had bled to build. The absolute, uncompromising truth of her maternal devotion had finally shattered her chains. Aiden wrapped his small, incredibly strong arms around her neck, pressing his wet cheek against her collarbone. The boy was unharmed, his molten gold eyes slowly fading back to a soft, stormy grey as the immediate threat evaporated. He patted her trembling shoulder with quiet, solemn reassurance, intuitively understanding the massive sacrifice she had just made. By unleashing the silver fire, she had permanently marked their location in the magical ether. Every elite tracker, every hostile matriarch, and the Alpha King himself would now know exactly where they were. Releasing her son gently, Seren crawled desperately toward the bleeding guardian pinned against the rocks. Cormac was pale, his breathing shallow and ragged, his left leg a mangled mess of torn flesh. The old warrior coughed, a thin line of blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, but his single eye was wide with absolute, reverent awe as he stared at the young mother. You burned them," Cormac wheezed, his voice barely a whisper against the crashing ocean waves. "The light. You are of the ancient line." "Hush, Cormac. Save your strength," Seren murmured, her voice trembling as she pressed her glowing hands directly over his catastrophic wounds. She pushed the last remaining reserves of her celestial warmth into his broken body, desperately trying to knit the torn muscles together and stabilize his fading pulse. "You protected him. You stood between my son and the dark. I will not let you die here." The healing magic was physically agonizing, draining the very life force from her own exhausted core. Her vision swam with dark, dizzying spots, and her lungs burned as if she were breathing crushed glass, but she stubbornly refused to pull away. The resilient healer poured her pure, gold-and-silver warmth into the stoic guardian until his ragged breathing finally leveled out and the violent bleeding ceased. When she finally pulled her hands back, Cormac was unconscious but stable. The immediate crisis had passed, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence in the ruined clearing. Seren sat back on her heels, her chest heaving in the freezing air, her hands heavily coated in blood and silver ash, gazing around the scorched, glowing forest floor. The absolute reality of her situation settled heavily into her bones. The quiet, invisible life of Neve the apothecary was permanently dead. She could no longer hide behind thick woolen cloaks and suppressive amulets. She fully embraced her supreme sovereign power, and there was no going back to the shadows. "Thank you for forcing me out," she thought, directing the silent, defiant message toward the distant obsidian throne of Thornmir, because being cast into the freezing wilderness had allowed her to discover a better strength, a purer power, and a fiercely loyal family, and she would never, ever look back at the broken girl she used to be. As she carefully lifted Cormac's heavy, unconscious frame with the lingering remnants of her magical strength, preparing to carry him back to the cottage, a deeply unsettling sensation suddenly rippled through her body. It was not the cold wind, nor the exhaustion of the battle. It was her left wrist. The dead, flat, ash-grey claiming mark, the hollow scar that had been devoid of life for over 2 years, suddenly gave a sharp, violent throb. It was not the sickening, decaying pulse of a dying man she had felt months ago. It was a searing, localized spike of pure, aggressive heat. Seren gasped, almost dropping the Guardian's shoulders. She stumbled backward, her wide eyes snapping toward the eastern tree line. The phantom compass in her chest, the ancient somatic bond she had violently suppressed and ignored, was suddenly screaming with terrifying proximity. The heat on her wrist was increasing exponentially with every passing second, burning with the familiar, intense molten gold signature of a massive predator rapidly closing the distance. He was here. The Alpha King had crossed the edge of the world, and the silent sanctuary of Brindle Hollow was about to face the wrath of a weeping, desperate beast. The searing heat radiating from the crescent scar on her left wrist was no longer just a phantom echo. It was a violent, physical reality, burning with the intensity of a blacksmith's forge against her delicate skin. Seren stumbled backward in the center of the scorched clearing, her breath catching sharply in her throat as the aggressive, molten gold rhythm intensified. The freezing coastal wind continued to whip around her, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of ozone and the swirling silver ash of the incinerated assassins, but she could not feel the bitter winter cold. She could only feel the terrifying, undeniable proximity of the massive predator closing the final distance. The eastern tree line did not simply part, it shattered entirely. It was not the calculated, synchronized arrival of a disciplined royal guard. It was an eruption of frantic, desperate, unadulterated violence, massive. Ancient pine branches cracked and splintered into jagged shards as a colossal black wolf exploded from the dense fog-choked underbrush. This was not the immaculate, terrifying, sovereign beast that had stood proudly at the obsidian altar of Thornmir. The creature that crashed into the clearing was a starving, emaciated shadow of its former glory. Its dark fur was heavily matted with frozen mud and dried blood, its massive paws torn and bleeding freely onto the pristine snow. The beast skidded to an abrupt halt, its heavy claws carving deep trenches into the frozen earth, its massive chest heaving with ragged, desperate exhaustion. Behind the monstrous wolf, a dozen elite royal trackers burst into the clearing. They were the most hardened, lethal warriors in the known territories, yet they immediately froze in their tracks. their weapons lowered automatically as they took in the catastrophic impossible scene before them. They stared in paralyzing terror at the scorched granite boulders, the lingering celestial silver light illuminating the forest canopy, and the quiet, beautiful apothecary who had just obliterated 5 feral mercenaries with the power of a living goddess. But the massive black wolf did not look at the celestial destruction. He did not look at the elite guards, he only looked at her. The beast let out a sound that shattered the freezing air. It was not a roar of dominance or territorial claim. It was a broken, whimpering keen that vibrated with years of unspoken agony. The heavy bones of the wolf cracked and snapped in a rapid, fluid motion. Within a single heartbeat, Kalin Valerius knelt in the snow in his human form. He was entirely unrecognizable from the cold, untouchable king who had publicly rejected her. The heavy silver armor and the dark ceremonial furs were gone, replaced by a ragged, freezing tunic that hung loosely from his severely diminished frame. His face was pale, his sharp cheekbones cutting harshly through his hollow cheeks, and his hands were heavily wrapped in blood-soaked linen. But it was his storm, grey eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. They were no longer vacant or clouded by dark magic. They were burning with a frantic, desperate, absolute adoration. Seren reacted purely on maternal instinct. She stepped backward, swiftly pulling the silver-haired child directly behind her legs to shield him from view. She raised her calloused, blood-stained hands, her palms instantly glowing with the lethal, blinding silver fire she had just used to incinerate the assassins. She was fully prepared to unleash the cosmic inferno upon the king himself if he took a single aggressive step toward her son. The fierce protectiveness of a mother completely overrode any lingering romantic grief. "Do not come any closer," the young mother warned, her voice a sharp, unyielding blade that cut effortlessly through the howling wind. Kalin did not move forward. He remained perfectly still on the frozen earth, ignoring the lethal celestial magic aimed directly at his chest. His storm-grey eyes slowly drifted downward, tracking the highly protective movement of her body. For the very first time in his life, the Alpha King of Thornmir locked eyes with Aidan Van Trell. The silence in the clearing became so absolute, so unbearably heavy, that the distant crashing of the ocean sounded like a whisper. Kalin stared at the 3-year-old boy peering out from behind his mother's woolen skirt. He saw the brilliant, luminescent silver hair that mirrored the ancient legends of the moon, but more devastatingly, he saw the fierce, uncompromising molten gold flaring in the child's irises. It was the exact, undeniable genetic signature of the Valerius royal line. The staggering truth hit the exhausted monarch with the catastrophic force of a physical avalanche. He had a son, a beautiful, powerful heir that he had unknowingly banished to the freezing edge of the world. The somatic bond connecting the 2 fated mates, violently suppressed and deeply scarred by the matriarch's dark magic, suddenly roared to life across the short distance. Seren expected to feel the oppressive, commanding weight of a royal alpha demanding his property. Instead, a wave of profound, suffocating grief slammed into her chest. It was a torrent of pure, unadulterated regret so intense it physically forced the breath from her lungs. She felt the exact moment the king's heart shattered. Kalin Valerius did not issue a royal command. He did not demand his rightful heir. The most feared, ruthless predator in 3 kingdoms simply collapsed entirely. His broad shoulders caved inward as he fell forward, burying his scarred, frost-bitten face into the freezing mixture of snow and silver ash at her feet. His massive frame trembled violently, racked by deep, harrowing sobs that echoed with the agonizing weight of 3 lost years. He was weeping. The invincible sovereign was openly weeping in the dirt before his entire elite guard. "I did not know," the Alpha gasped. His voice was completely broken, his words tearing violently from a throat raw with screaming. He kept his face pressed into the freezing earth, absolutely refusing to look up, fundamentally believing he did not deserve to gaze upon her light. The matriarch, the dark curse. It stole my mind. It poisoned my soul. But it does not excuse what I did to you. It does not excuse the frozen hell I cast you into. Seren stood completely frozen, the lethal silver fire slowly dimming in her palms. She stared down at the weeping man, her mind racing to comprehend the devastating truth of his words. A mind control curse. The cold, vacant eyes at the altar suddenly made terrifying sense. The absolute lack of hesitation when he slipped the lunar moon ring onto Maria's finger was not born of cruelty, but of a deeply toxic, inescapable magical bondage. The man who had broken her heart had been a prisoner in his own mind, forced to watch his body destroy the only thing he truly loved. Kalin's massive, trembling hands dug into the frozen soil, as if desperately trying to bury his own existence. "I have searched every corner of this world for you," he whispered into the snow, his tears rapidly freezing against the dirt. "I have died 1,000 times every single day since the priest broke the spell. I am a rotting shell, Seren. I am nothing without you. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I only ask that you let me protect you. Let me stand between you and the dark. I will lay the crown of Thornmir at your feet, and I will spend the rest of my miserable life earning the air that you breathe." The elite trackers remained entirely silent, their heads bowed in reverent submission. They were witnessing the complete dismantling of a dynasty. The stunning moment, a feared leader willingly traded his supreme authority for the mercy of an outcast Omega. It was a beautiful, undeniable testament to the absolute power of the true fated mate bond. Aiden stepped out from behind his mother's legs. The small, silver-haired boy tilted his head, his molten gold eyes studying the massive weeping man on the ground. The child did not sense a threat. He did not sense a monster. He only sensed a profound, echoing sadness that perfectly mirrored the empty space he had always felt in his own young heart. Aiden took a small, cautious step forward, ignoring his mother's protective grip. The healer watched her son approach the broken sovereign, her heart hammering frantically against her ribs. She remembered the bitter nights she had spent convincing herself that they were better off alone. She had told herself that the ruthless Alpha was incapable of love. But as she looked at the trembling man, yielding his entire existence in the freezing mud, a profound realization washed over her. Because monsters do not kneel to speak to children. Because monsters do not search for a year. Because monsters do not look at me the way you do. She slowly lowered her hands, completely extinguishing the last remaining sparks of her celestial magic. The quiet, deeply observant woman she had become in Brindle Hollow took over, overriding the furious, newly awakened goddess. She stepped forward, her heavy leather boots crunching softly on the scorched earth. She knelt in the freezing mud directly in front of the weeping king, ignoring the blood and ash staining her clothes. "Look at me, Kalin," she whispered, her voice a soft, steady anchor in the chaotic storm of his despair. He flinched, his broad shoulders tensing as if he expected a physical blow, but he slowly, agonizingly raised his head. His face was a ruined landscape of tears, frostbite, and deep, hollow exhaustion. Seren reached out. She did not use her lethal solar fire. She simply pressed her calloused, bare hand gently against his freezing, stubble-ruined cheek. The moment her skin made contact with his, a blinding, earth-shattering shockwave of pure warmth detonated between them. The dead, flat claiming mark on her left wrist peeled away like burned parchment. In its place, the ancient crescent ignited with a brilliant, pulsing, golden light. The violent, psychological wound that had festered in both of their souls for 3 years was instantly incinerated by the undeniable truth of their connection. Kalin let out a ragged, desperate gasp, his eyes widening in pure shock as the warm magic surged through his atrophied muscles, rapidly repairing the catastrophic physical decay caused by the severed bond. He leaned heavily into her touch, melting into the quiet, absolute safety of her presence. "You are not a rotting shell," she murmured, her thumb gently wiping a frozen tear from his cheek. "You are the father of my son, and you are finally home." The king wrapped his massive, trembling arms around her waist, burying his face into her stomach as he sobbed with profound, overwhelming relief. Aidan moved closer, placing his small, warm hand gently on the broad, shaking back of the massive alpha. The elite guard dropped to their knees in perfect unison, officially pledging their eternal loyalty not just to their cured king, but to the blinding, undeniable sovereignty of their new celestial queen. In the weeks that followed, the absolute retribution was swift and unmerciful. Calin Valerius returned to the capital, not as a cursed prisoner, but as a deeply restored, fiercely protective monarch holding the hand of a living deity. The public trial was a devastating spectacle for the corrupted nobility. Beatrice Vane and Maria Sterling were permanently stripped of their titles, their wealth, and their pack standing. They were banished to the most desolate corners of the realm, ensuring their toxic manipulation could never reach the throne again. The royal guards easily transported the recovering Cormac Thutherborn to the palace where the stoic neighbor was honored with a permanent, highly respected position within the elite vanguard. But the true victory was not found in the cold, grand halls of the Obsidian Keep. It was found in the quiet, undeniable healing of their shattered world. Seren did not return to the shadows as a voiceless servant. She was crowned the Lunar Sovereign, ruling beside her mate with an observant strength that fundamentally transformed the harsh traditions of the pack. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the capital evaporated, replaced by the warm, radiant light of her celestial lineage. As the spring sun finally broke through the lingering winter clouds, Callan stood in the lush, blooming royal gardens, watching his silver-haired son chase a butterfly with impossible, graceful speed. Seren stood beside him, her head resting gently against his broad, muscular shoulder, the glowing mark on her wrist pulsing with a steady, comforting rhythm. The king wrapped his arm around her waist, pressing a soft, reverent kiss to the crown of her head. He had survived the darkest, coldest corners of the earth just to find the light that he had foolishly cast away. The thawing, the people would say for generations to come, was not just about the weather. It was about a king who learned to love, and a queen who taught him how.